All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the CTL seminar series. Today we have with us Professor Ashish Kabra, who is going to talk about design of contingent free shipping policy and the role of return environment. Ashish, I know him for some time already, and I also know his advisors. He's a assistant professor right now at the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. He conducts empirical and theoretical research using causal inference, structural estimation, game theory, and optimization methods. Particularly, we remember his work from the bike sharing era, right? That was some of the earliest work that he has published, a very, very fascinating work. His research focuses on studying the interplay between platform operations, consumer behavior, and sustainability in the domains such as e-commerce, online B2B platforms, retail stores, and urban transportation. His research work has been published in top journals and prestigious awards, including, I think, he got a teaching award also at the Smith School. Prior to joining Maryland, he completed his graduate studies in OM, in operations management at NCR, and he has done his undergraduate studies in computer science at BITS Pilani. So thank you all for joining this presentation, and I'm sure we'll have an exciting talk from Ashish. We look forward to your talk, Ashish, and feel free to interact as you proceed. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Deepjeet, and the CTL sort of department as well for having me here. I've had a sort of really fun day here, just having a bunch of meetings. We had a super nice interaction in the morning with thriving startup in the area. So it's my pleasure to be visiting Ahmedabad. It's my first time here, and thank you for that. So as Deepjit mentioned, I am Ashish Kabra. I'm an assistant professor at University of Maryland. And this is broadly a work in the space of e-commerce. And I'll sort of break down, it's a fairly sort of involved title, but I'll break down some of the elements of it as we go along. This is a joint work with some of my colleagues and good friends. So with Adal Maghrabi, who's at Maryland, Nitish Jain at London Business School, and Seher Hemati, who just recently started working at Uber. So thanks for the great introduction. So I can just skip through this slide that I was planning to use to talk about some of my research work. So let me just sort of get right into the topic of today's presentation. So one thing that got me interested in this particular topic is this statistic that I had come across a couple of years ago when I was sort of starting to think about this project. And so the numbers there sort of say that if you think about product returns in sort of typical retail operations, in brick and mortar stores, roughly about 5 to 15% of whatever we purchased is returned eventually to that particular location. Now that number, when we think about online purchases or e-commerce purchases, has risen to about 15 to 40%. A typical number there is 30%. And that's a dramatic increase compared to the numbers that we have sort of been used to earlier. And so what this all amounts to is a huge sort of value of goods that is eventually returned to the retailers. So in US alone, this is sort of $760 billion in 2021. And after COVID, this number has been increasing. And returns are very expensive for retailers. Like if you think about sort of every single item that we return to, let's say, Myntra, it costs them about 30 to 66% of the item's original price just to sort of like collect the return, process it, maybe sort of figure out if they can resell it, repackage it, and all of that. And if you sort of have sort of read about e-commerce or retail operations in general, one thing that is true over there is they operate with very thin margins, like 5% or something like that. And so given that, this number stands out quite a bit. So returns are generally expensive for retailers, but that's not the whole story. So there's this one example which I like to use. So CBC is sort of like a news agency in Canada. And so they ran this interesting experiment where they ordered like a dozen different items from Amazon. So things like toys and jeans and, other stuff. And because there is so little known about how e-commerce companies deal with their returns, so they did the following. They put these RFID trackers in each of the items that they bought, and they returned these like 12 items they had bought. And what they found was, at least to me, pretty sort of novel and amazing. So out of about a dozen different items they had bought from this Amazon Canada, only about 4 were eventually resold. So majority of them were never resold to a customer. What happened with these remaining items where they were sort of like moving from a particular facility to some next facility to some other facility with sort of no clear destination in mind. In fact, a lot of them eventually just ended up in sort of faraway places in landfills like this, right? And so the key point I want to highlight here is that returns are not just costly for retailers, but also costly for us as a society and the environment as well. Okay, so it's important, and this is what got me interested into this topic because I feel there's a lot that is to be studied in this particular domain. Now, of course, I'm in a business school, so again, sort of coming back from like a retailer lens, a retailer or an e-commerce operator cannot optimize their business just by focusing on returns. But I sort of want to make a pitch that it's still important for them to think about it. And one key reason is that if you think about sort of the cost of a typical e-commerce operator, after sort of thinking about cost of products, which of course accounts for a significant portion of their cost, shipping cost and return cost, basically this transportation and logistics, that accounts for a majority or sort of a huge fraction of their operating expenses. Okay. And it is typically said that what a brick and mortar store incurs in like real estate cost, e-commerce operator pretty much sort of incurs their cost in a lot of these transportation and logistics operations, right? And so even for the retailer, even if they don't care about all these environmental externalities, it is important to get these costs in order to make their operations efficient. One particular perspective, which I feel is missing when I talk to a lot of organizations, is a lot of their decisions are made in silos. So if you sort of even think about like the shipping and the return, often the shipping or like the sell side to the customer will be dealt by a different department within a particular, let's say like a company, and the returns will be a different department. And often the decisions that are made are sort of not comprehensive enough. So that is sort of one additional angle that I'll bring into this particular talk. Yes, question. Sure. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I understand
Sure.
that spent a lot of time on everything.
Yeah.
Okay. Going to a
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. I think there are several reasons to it. One of them, of course, could be that products are defective and therefore retailers don't bother reselling them. But it might very well be that the return sort of supply chains are not very well optimized. And so people are just very focused on selling as much new stuff as they can and not so much sort of integrating it with the other part of the supply chain. And I'm sure I don't know everything about this space, so there could be more things that are going on. Right. So this is the retailer side of the story, that they should ideally sort of think carefully about the shipping, returns, transportation, logistics part of their operations. These are expensive, and ideally they should sort of pass on these costs to their customers so that customers sort of don't order things which they don't need and internalize some of these consequences. Now, if you think about customers, on the other hand, we don't want to pay any of these costs. Like if you sort of look at a typical customer, we really like free shipping. Majority of customers are like that. In fact, one of the top reasons why people may not buy from a particular e-commerce operator or might sort of add a few things to their cart and not eventually purchase is because a retailer or an e-commerce operator is charging them a particular kind of a shipping fee which they don't want to pay, right? So even though sort of retailers or e-commerce operators are aware that these are expensive operations, we should somehow sort of get customers on board. Customers are not willing to sort of participate in that particular cost. And so what we end up seeing in reality is some sort of a mix of these two things, where a retailer wants to charge for a shipping fee, but a customer doesn't want to pay that. Is this particular form of a shipping fee charge, which we call a contingent free shipping policy, right? So this was part of the title of my talk. It may not have made a lot of sense then, but let me break it down what it really means. So contingent free shipping policy basically has two components. It has a certain threshold and it has a certain shipping fee. And we're all used to it. In fact, I'll sort of show you some examples in a bit, but basically there is typically a threshold. And if you purchase something from an e-commerce operator that is above the threshold, then you get free shipping, which is what we really want as a customers. On the other hand, if you purchase from an e-commerce operator and a basket size or order that is below a certain threshold, let's say below 1,000 rupees, if that's the threshold, then you have to pay a certain fee. So in some sense, kind of a mix of the two things that customers want as well as what the retailer wants. Okay, and we see, and these kind of policies are literally very, very common. We see them all around us. So, I mean, I have some sort of US examples here, but also some examples from India. So Amazon in India, for example, has this threshold of 499 rupees. And if you fall below that threshold, you have to pay 40 rupees in shipping fee. If you are above the threshold, then you pay nothing, right? And sort of we'll think a little bit more carefully about this kind of a model and what kind of behavior does it sort of incentivizes customers to operate with and things like that. But this is a fairly common structure of how retailers make customers pay for shipping fee. Okay, so this is a contingent free shipping policy. This is somewhat different from other model of shipping fee, which is Amazon Prime or Flipkart Plus and all of these models, which are a little bit more sort of subscription-based models, like you pay a monthly fee and then you get free deliveries every single time you order. And they have their sort of own things to think about. One distinction I want to make here is that some big players like Amazon or Flipkart and Walmart can operate with those subscription kind of policies because they have a huge loyal base of customers who sort of order from them very frequently, but most of the retailers don't really have that. And so this is what we see fairly often if you go outside some of these big players. Okay, so that is what I'm focusing on. One other element that I'll bring in, and because I said I'll sort of try to think about the entire value chain, the shipping side and the return side together. And so from the return side, one other thing I want to sort of think about simultaneously is what does your return policy look like? So what I have here is basically a couple of sort of graphics, again, a little bit from US perspective, but I'll relate it with how things are over here. And essentially what I'm thinking about is how easy it is for you to return a particular product once you bought it from an e-commerce company, let's say Flipkart or Myntra or Amazon. Right? And so outside India, what is still very typical, and in that sense, I think India is way ahead in terms of e-commerce operations compared to a lot of other places in the world. What is very typical, let's say in the place I live, is if I buy something from Amazon, if I have to return something, I literally have to go to a nearby, like a drop-off locker facility or some UPS kind of a locker system to return that particular product. On the other hand, what is much more common over here in India, and some of the companies outside India are experimenting with this as well, is at-home pickup of returns. And so this is basically something that we are all used to. Someone comes to your home, picks up the return that you want, and sort of takes care of that. Okay? And so a clear difference between these two models is these kind of returns are much more easier to do. These kind of returns involve a little bit of a hassle cost. Right? And so that is basically one dimension I'm thinking about, is what is the hassle cost of making a return when you're dealing with a particular e-commerce company. In this particular setting, and in my empirical context as well, I'll soon sort of describe what kind of data I'm using. The hassle cost is a non-monetary cost, right? Here, the difference is not so much money. It's just that whether someone comes to my home or whether I go somewhere and sort of drop off my stuff. But you can easily sort of translate it to other contexts where, let's say, a retailer does not charge any money for taking up the return versus some other retailer who charges you a certain kind of a fee to take your return, right? So this hassle cost doesn't always have to be non-monetary. It can be monetary as well, or it can be as simple as there are two retailers who are charging, who are offering you at-home pickup facility, but with one retailer, it's really easy to schedule a return. Like it's super flexible, whereas some other retailer might be very sort of rigid that there is only one time in a day when you can schedule a certain at-home return pickup, right? So this hassle dimension can sort of show up differently in different contexts within different companies, but that's one thing I'll think about a little bit, is how does ease of return play a role in how you think about designing your CFS policy. So the key sort of question, sort of just to put it more concretely here, I'm going to think about is how should a retailer set their CFS policy, which is how should they design what threshold to use and what shipping fee to use. And in particular, how should that change given your return policy? If your return policy is very convenient, that is very little hassle involved, versus if your return is inconvenient, there is some sort of a hassle involved. How should this threshold and shipping fee change with that sort of distinction? Okay, so that is sort of more precisely the question that I'm going to sort of dig deeper into. Before I do that, can I sort of, I mean, this is a little bit vague at this point, but a retailer that is optimizing per profit, and let's say you are thinking about someone who has a convenient return policy, should they set a higher threshold or a lower threshold? Just if you want to take a guess. Shivam, you read the papers. You don't get to choose. Or you can tell me, that's okay. Higher threshold if you have a convenient return policy. Okay. If you have an inconvenient return policy, then you want to have a higher threshold. Okay. 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 Sure. Okay. Yeah. I see. Yeah. Sure. Okay. So I can see like you're thinking a little bit ahead. The question at this point, at least for me, is a little bit difficult to answer because there are several components that go into sort of answering it. So let me break down what are some of the things we should be thinking about. Okay? And then we'll sort of come back to the logic that Shubham was talking about. And so let's sort of step into like, let's say a shopper's mind, let's say my mind, I'm buying from this particular retailer who has a particular sort of a threshold. In this case, threshold is $100. And if I am ordering anything below $100, then I have to pay a $10. Okay. And let's say I came to this particular e-commerce operator, think I'll buy these two things, like a particular sweater and a particular pair of shoe, and I add them to my cart and I see that it's $90 now. And I'm deciding, well, okay, now let me sort of make this purchase. And I go sort of to the final page, I see, well, I will have to pay a $10 fee if I have to check out that cart, right? So at that point, I have to make some decision, right? And so what are some of the choices I have, if you want to tell me? So add another item, that's one thing I can do. And so let me actually, so that's a great point. Let me sort of go by one. So let's say someone is super naive like I am. I would sort of not think very strategically. I would just say, well, because I am below 100, all I can do is just pay the $10 shipping fee and I'll just check out my cart. Okay. And so compared to a baseline policy where, let's say the retailer says, well, I cannot charge my customers any shipping fee, this is still a little bit better because at least now I've passed on my shipping fee, the cost that I incur to my customers. And so my shipping fee burden has reduced a little bit, right? And so in some sense, this is still okay for the retailer. It's getting a good behavior out of their customers. I can do something else, which you mentioned, which is what I call pad my order. And pad my order can sort of come from a few different things. So one possibility is I was sort of on the fence about buying this particular t-shirt, which let's say cost $15. Now I just add it to my basket. And the advantage of doing that is now I am above that $100 threshold and I can potentially save on that $10 fee that I would have otherwise incurred. Okay? And so that's kind of a smart decision. It can also come from like few different mechanisms as well. Let's say I was planning to buy something in the future and I can bring that purchase sort of forward. I can buy that thing right now, or I might postpone a current purchase, wait until like, a couple more weeks when I know I'm going to buy something else. So combine a few different purchases and sort of reach a similar place where I'm above a certain threshold. All of that is basically a padding order to get above the threshold. This is still good for the retailer because overall, it may sort of lead to higher demand from customers or the same kind of demand if they're combining different orders, but at least the shipping cost burden is a little bit reduced. If we think about sort of how often do I ship to this customer or shipping cost per dollar, revenue from this customer and so on, right? So in both these senses, the retailer is at least a little bit better off. A third possibility is I can sort of conclude that, well, this retailer is not good enough for me. There's a store or a mall right next to where I live, and so I might as well just walk there and buy from there rather than buying from this particular retailer. And so that kind of a choice is called abandoning my order. And that is, of course, bad for the retailer because I have now lost some demand I could have gotten from this particular customer. Right? And so in some sense, this is a key trade-off which a retailer has to manage, that they want to get something from the customer, but at the same time, they don't want to lose them. Right? And so they want to find some sort of a sweet spot in between these different decisions their customers can make. One other element, which sort of none of these choices have touched upon, is this returns part, and how returns are relevant in all of this. Like different choices I'm making, how does that affect whether or not I return a certain product? And so one thing which is kind of like padding the order, but not really, is I can be a little bit intentional about making a certain kind of purchase. Let's say this random hat, which is on top of page. I have no intention of keeping it. I just add it to my cart. I go above the threshold, and then as soon as I get my order, I just sort of go to the website and just return that. Devjit is nodding because you have done it, of course. And so these are the kind of purchases I call bubble purchases because these are not real, right? Once you sort of poke into it, it's really gone. And so, of course, this is not great for anyone because as a customer, I have still bought the same amount of stuff I would have bought otherwise. I have not paid retailer anything. As a retailer, my demand remains pretty much the same. I have incurred more shipping costs and I've incurred more return costs as well now to cater to this particular customer, right? And so again, that's sort of one more behavior I need to be sort of cognizant about as I'm designing these CFS policies. Okay, so that's how sort of returns play a role, and that's why I wanted to tie the shipping and the return part together when I was thinking about this particular problem. If there are any questions at this point, clarifications as well. Right. Yeah. 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 And I think it's I would say still a very emerging space. The retailers, at least I sort of follow, are experimenting with a lot of different policies. One thing that was very much a norm in US is you never charge for returns. Like even these restocking fees, etc., are fairly uncommon. And part of the reason behind that is that returns can be genuine as well. Like not every single return is because a customer was trying to game the system. And so you don't want to sort of create this perception among your customers that if I eventually want to return something, I'll have to sort of forego a certain kind of benefit I have gotten. Because I could have sort of genuinely wanted all of this. And then now I want to return this. And if you ask me to pay for like the $10 shipping fee, it's a little bit unfair for me if this product is genuinely like a bad fit for me or something like that. So I don't see that happening a lot. But then I also see like Myntra, for example, is now experimenting a little bit with like charging like personalized return fee based on your past return behavior and things like that. So I think it's an evolving space. Yeah. Got it. Right. Sure. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah. Yeah. I think that would partly mitigate this. Yeah. I am sort of working with a more nominal model that I see around where a retailer would allow all kinds of returns and still sort of stick to their original agreement that you got free shipping because you were about the threshold. But I can see like some of these policies will discourage this behavior. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Yeah, I mean, there's more to think about here for sure because, yeah, if I'm returning 90 for a $15 purchase that I'm keeping, yeah, there's something fishy going on maybe. So to sort of study this problem in a little bit more concrete manner, what we did was we collaborated with a large retailer in India. And so even though I'm showing a lot of these dollar numbers, actually all the real numbers are in Indian rupees. So I'll start talking about Indian rupees from now on. And so we essentially collaborated with a fashion retailer in India, one of the sort of big players here. And they were comfortable sharing some of the older data with us for sort of non-compete reasons and things like that. So we had about a year worth of data from them. They operated in most of the, or like more than 50% of the pin codes in India at that point. One nice thing was in the data, they were constantly, or not constantly, but they were experimenting with their CFS policies quite a bit. And so what I have here is basically there was this time period early on when they had a high threshold and a low shipping fee. Then they went to a low threshold, low fee, then a high threshold, low fee, then a high threshold, high fee. Right? And so they were sort of, there were these nice variations in terms of CFS policies that the retailer was using, which we can potentially exploit to understand, well, what effect does it have on customer behavior? Okay. And of course, I'll probably not talk too much about this except for the very last slide. We were a little bit careful in how to sort of use this variation so that we get some sort of a causal estimate and not just a correlation. But at this point, I'll sort of just say that there is this temporal variation in terms of CFS policy. In terms of numbers, the high threshold is roughly 999 rupees. The low threshold is 499 rupees. You don't have to remember this, but I'm just saying it out. Low fee is 99 rupees and a high fee is 149 rupees. So those are sort of the numbers we are talking about. One other variation, because I also talked about the CFS policies, but also the hassle costs in making a return and how that can potentially factor in. So in terms of the return cost, at that point, the retailer had a bunch of markets where they offered this at-home pickup service. So if you want to return something, someone will come to your home, pick up the particular product. And so that was essentially in a lot of markets, which accounted for roughly their 75% of sort of volume. And in remaining 25% of the markets, there was no such facility. So they operated with what I call like a without pickup feature, where if you want to return something, you have to go post it from a nearby, like a courier service or a post office. The retailer would reimburse you, like they would send you roughly 100 rupees worth of voucher or something like that. But there was still a difference between these two kind of markets. In one, without pickup markets, there was a hassle involved in making the returns. In with pickup, there was no hassle involved. Right? Beyond these details, all of the other details pretty much remained the same. There was this 30-day window in which you can make the return, and all the other sort of details pretty much remain the same. Okay? And so this is another variation I'll use to sort of understand what is the causal effect of the hassle cost in making a return on how you should set your CFS policies. So one interesting distinction is the CFS policy variation was happening over time. And this is a variation which is almost a cross-section variation. Some markets are of one kind, the other markets of other kind. One thing that sort of we wanted to be a little bit more careful about is, of course, the assignment of what markets are with pickup, what markets are without pickup is not random. That would have been ideal if we could experiment and just assign with pickup and without pickup, but our retailers did not want us to do that. And we know there is a very clear difference. The bigger markets often have with pickup, the smaller markets have without pickup. And so to be careful that we are sort of estimating a causal effect, we want to be comparing apples to apples. So we essentially sort of rely, we have some alternate methods as well, but one of the methods we rely on is very simple, this propensity score matching, kind of find markets which are otherwise similar in terms of a bunch of these features we collect about each and every pin code, like population, literacy, distance to major cities, farm employment, nighttime luminosity, closest warehouse, and so on. Just a lot of proxy for what does pin code look like. And the only variation, therefore, that sort of presumably remains is one market is with pickup, one market is without pickup, and we get to see some differences. Okay, so that's the empirical setting. So now let me actually just jump into the data. And before showing you some sort of empirical model and some estimates, I am a big fan of just like looking at the data and exploring it and getting some sense of what is really going on. And so let's take a look at what we see over here. So I have three histograms over here. The first histogram is when the retailer was operating with a LL policy. So LL is a low threshold, low shipping fee policy. Then they jump to HL policy, which was high threshold, low shipping fee. And then here again, the high threshold and high shipping fee. Okay. So what we see over here is the distribution of orders shifts quite a bit. As the threshold increases or as the shipping fee increases, more and more customers choose to go above the threshold and place their orders, right? So this is basically a reflection of the order padding behavior we had sort of hypothesized earlier. Okay? And so we clearly see that these parameters that this retailer is operating in has a distinct impact on what customers choose to purchase from this retailer. Yes. Sure. Yeah, so that's a great question. So the question was, can we label a particular return as a bubble return or not? Or in fact, the same question applies for padding as well. Can we say this is a padded order or not a padded order? And I would say there is no easy way to do that, because if you look at an order which is 1,200 rupees, which is about 1,000, it probably is genuinely 200, or someone actually padded their order to go about 1,200. You can statistically say there is more of that, but you cannot pinpoint this is a padded order, this is not a padded order. And same for returns as well. Therefore, someone could have a genuine return versus someone could have like a bubble kind of a return. Statistically, you can say there are more of these happening, but you cannot pinpoint this versus that. Right, right. So I'll show you a couple of pictures, maybe that will sort of make things a little bit more clear. One thing I want to point out is, so like I sort of said that this is a reflection of order padding that is going on. And to a large extent, that is true. But what this can also mean is a bunch of other choices that I talked about. So for example, I talked about order abandonment, that some customers not choosing to purchase from this retailer and going to someone else. In fact, just order abandonment can also show you graphs like this to see why. Let's say some of these customers which were below this threshold, now when you're charging them a high fee, choose to not purchase from the retailer. So it's not that customers are necessarily going above the threshold, but you're losing some of the customers below the threshold. And that can also pretty much lead to same kind of charts, right? So we will require a little bit more careful sort of separation of this padding, pay, and abandonment behavior. But overall, what we can sort of draw from here is that these changes are having a clear impact on customer behavior. Okay. So this is with pickup markets. If I look at without pickup markets, the graphs are pretty much similar. They're a little bit more noisier because the data is a little bit smaller in size. But sort of when we'll work with statistical models and things like that, we will note that the numbers are not very different, right? So again, what is happening is with each and every like threshold change or fee increase, there is a smaller mass of purchases below the threshold and a higher mass of purchases right above the threshold. So some combination of padding and abandonment behavior going on here as well. I want to show you the return plots and then the model and some of the numbers around that. Now, when I want to think about return numbers, like under these different policies, LL, HL, and HH, what are the sort of average number of orders that have a return in them and things like that? I would say it's not a fair comparison to compare the average return rate in the LL policy compared to HL policy, because the average order size is much higher for HL policy compared to LL policy. And one thing that is true in the data, let me actually jump to the next slide and show you, is as the order size increases, the return rate increases as well. So what I have here is not just comparing average return rate for different policies, but given an order size, what is the return rate? because that's a little bit more fair comparison. Like you're comparing a 500 rupees basket or a 1200 rupees basket under these three different policies, and you're taking away the effect that, well, of course, the return rate increases as the order size increases, but beyond that, is there a difference between return rate across these three policies? Okay. And so let's sort of take a look at these three lines over here. So what we have is a green line with LL policy, the most sort of lenient policy, and the red line is the HH policy, the more high threshold, high fee policy. And so if you look at this first part, which is below the 499 rupees, below the low threshold, or in fact, even the second part between 499 and 999, above the high threshold part, the three lines pretty much overlap with each other. The return rates are not very different. Okay, kind of makes sense, or at least doesn't sort of alarm us. However, if we look at orders above 1,000 up to a certain sort of a range, above that, these three lines very clearly separate from each other. What do you think is going on? Like, what does that mean? The threshold, and so people are going above the threshold.
After that, the return.
Why are they increasing? Right, right. I think you mentioned it earlier, the bubble purchases. So there's more of bubble purchases. So remember the process, right? So what is happening is the following. If I am subjected to a threshold of 1,000, and if you're charging me a high fee to fall below 1,000 rupees or 999 rupees, I am incentivized to go above the threshold at pretty much any cost. And so, of course, not every customer does this, but a significant portion of customers will add some random items to their basket, go above the threshold, and this random item may not have been like an intentional return, but I added something impulsively. So I'm more likely to return it once I get my particular purchase. Right, right. So that can be another form of hassle. Let's say if you instantly get your money back as soon as you click return. Right, yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I think the norm is, I'll have to look into the details. Actually, I've never sort of looked into this. I don't think it changed across the policies. So whatever it is, my understanding is it remained similar across these three policies. So it's probably not playing a role here, but it can be another dimension that the retailer can tweak a little bit to make the return process more hassle. But this is basically like, once I see this plot, the story was very clear to me. Like, all the models can now tell anything, but the story sort of is starting to build already, that there is this bubble purchase phenomenon that we hypothesize that's clearly going on here. Sure. 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 Yeah. Right. Yeah. So, I mean, in a visualization, you can only sort of account for so many things, but I don't know if I have the model here or not, but one of the analysis which we have done now for sort of the revision of the paper is, in fact, we have compared the same item, which was part of a order which was above the threshold, part of an order which was below the threshold, and we see a very clear difference in the return rate. And you can control for like number of items and like a bunch of other things, product category and so on. You still see a very clear difference. But that's a good point, because number of items definitely has increased for these orders. So this is with pickup markets, where the return process was easy. The hassle involved was pretty less. If we look at markets without pickup, where the return process has some hassles, sorry, just to finish the story here, as we sort of start looking at larger and larger order sizes, this is still with pickup markets, the lines start to become a little bit more noisy because the number of orders starts to decrease quite a bit, but the lines are not statistically as different from each other, which is again pretty intuitive as well. A padded order will only go up to a certain point. After that, it probably doesn't play much of a role. Now, this is for without pickup markets where the return process involves a lot of hassle, and sort of maybe a paper is a good place to look at this more carefully. But what we'll see is that these three lines are not very different from each other in any range of the data. They start with overlapping with each other, but even above the threshold, they continue to overlap with each other. So this sort of very clear distinction about the high threshold, which we had seen in with pickup markets, is not present in without pickup markets. And so what sort of this means to us at this point is, in absence of pickup, which is essentially if the return process involves higher amount of hassle, the bubble purchase phenomenon is not as sort of prominent. People are not engaging in that. And this is very different from the order padding graphs we had seen earlier, because in terms of order padding, the two markets looked very similar. People were sort of going above the threshold, the histograms were shifting in a similar manner. In terms of return patterns, the two markets are very different from each other. In with pickup markets, there is a very clear sort of evidence of bubble purchase, and without pickup markets, there is no clear evidence of that. So this is, I would say, sort of already giving us the main components of what will eventually decide what is a good CFS policy for each kind of market. These are the building blocks of that. And so if you want to tune out right now, this is what I would like you to remember, that order padding behavior is more or less similar across with or without pickup markets, or you vary the hassle cost and it doesn't change as much. But the bubble purchase phenomenon is very sort of largely a function of the hassle involved in your return process. To make some of this, I'll skip this a little bit. Yes, yes. Right. So here, what I'm exploiting is some markets have with pickup, some markets operate with pickup, as in someone will come to your home to pick up whatever you want to return. And some other markets don't have that option. So you have to go to a nearby post office or a courier facility to drop off that item. And right. 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 Yeah. Sure. Sure. Yeah. Okay. I see your point. Somehow I have a sense that especially in cities like which are very crowded and so on, you would rather have someone like my sister is a big user of this partner platform that I'm using. And every time I visit her in Pune, she always has like a few pickups scheduled. And so the person comes at whatever time she wants them to come at 9 a.m. when she's typically home, and the person would pick it up. So at least the impression I'd gotten from those anecdotes is at home pickup is just much more easier. But I see your point as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Right. 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 Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Fair enough. Yes. 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 Right. Sure. I understand your point. Actually, at some point we were talking with this retailer to get data on these like failed attempts, either at like delivery phase or the return phase. We weren't able to sort of get that data because that would have been a very clear indicator. Like, are there more sort of failures in? Yeah. Yeah. Right. Sure. Right. Right. So I think actually I'll double check this point, but I believe in a lot of these markets where you have an at-home option, you still have an option to send it yourself. So if you're someone who's who finds it much more convenient to ship it yourself because you don't want to deal with the scheduling part of it, you always have that option, because that's easy, right? You'll get a certain sort of reimbursement in your account. And so everyone has that option. It's just that this is an added feature if you want someone to come to your home and pick it up.
Prof, I have a question.
Yes.
Do we have any information on the distance
Sure.
for without pickup orders? So what is the distance of the drop-off point? Does the distance play a role in
Right.
increasing or decreasing the hassle and
Right. So that's a
change?
great question, actually, because that can be one other dimension, even without pickup markets. There's more hassle and there's even more hassle and so on. We haven't really looked at that. That's a great point. Because we do have, I believe we have location for each and every customer, and we should have information on the drop-off points as well. So that's a good point. Right. So this is a formal model that we use to sort of understand what is really going on, and it's a little bit involved. So I mean, there's only so much time we have. The details are much more clearly laid out in the paper, but I'll give you a gist of what we are trying to do here. So the nature of the model that we are using to understand the data, I would say, falls fairly in what we call these like interpretable models. So essentially what we are doing is modeling a customer purchase and a return process, which sort of takes into account what incentivizes them to like pay versus pad versus leave and so on. Right? And so the way we model that process is we say, well, a customer has some sort of a natural demand. And so that natural demand means that if you had free shipping, that is what you would order. We don't observe that directly, but that's sort of a latent parameter that we work with. So DI is your natural demand. Now, if your natural demand is above the threshold tau, then you don't care. Whatever the CFS policy is, you just place your order. On the other hand, if your natural demand is below the threshold, then you have to make a certain choice. You either pay the shipping fee, which is, let's say, size F, and you order DI, or you pad your order to go above the threshold tau. So you essentially reach a final order size of tau plus some yi factor, or you leave without order. Right? So these are essentially these three components that we had laid out earlier. So the way we model this, Maya is very familiar with this, is some sort of a choice modeling process where there is a certain utility for each of these choices. It is a function of what is your shipping fee F, what is your shipping fee F, what is your threshold tau, how far the threshold tau is from your order size DI and so on. So a bunch of different factors play a role here. But the nice thing here is you've understood the customer process really well, as opposed to throwing in some black box model, which may or may not capture some of the interactions between how these tau and F shape customer behavior. Okay, so we allow these parameters to be different for each kind of markets with pickup and without pickup. And so when we take this to the data, I mean, there are a couple of sort of steps involved before taking it to the data. I'll sort of skip that for now. Yeah, I'll just skip some of the details. So as I had told you earlier that some of these behaviors of padding and abandonment can look similar. So the model and the paper talks about this a little bit more clearly, allows you to separate this behavior, which just looking at the histograms will not allow you to do. So I'll sort of not talk about these details, but basically what we find is that, and again, something the pictures have already shown us, that as the threshold of the shipping fee increases, there are more and more people who engage in padding orders, as well as more people sort of abandon the orders and leave the market as well. The degree of padding is more or less similar across two kinds of markets, but it's a little bit higher in with pickup markets compared to without pickup markets. And so nothing dramatic here. We had mostly seen this through the pictures. The models just make these things a little bit more formal. In terms of looking at the return part, one nice thing we take advantage of is that for each and every order size, we sort of use the previous model that I had just shown you, the structural model, to think about what is the probability that that particular order is a padded order. And this is useful because if you sort of compare, if I actually am allowed to go like a couple of slides before, if we look at sort of these three lines over here in this middle range, the fact that HH line is over HL line can mean two things. One thing it can mean is people are more likely to engage in bubble purchases in HH policy compared to HL policy. The other thing it can mean is that there are more padded orders in HH policy And so same proportion of those orders are bubble purchases, but just because there are more padded orders, you see the return rate overall is higher, right? And so the model that I'm showing you here for returns essentially sort of teases out what is the effect of higher padding propensity under some policy versus how much increase in return rate because of more padding. And so the story that we learn from here is fairly similar to before. It's just that we get to quantify things right now. And so what we note here, and these are a little bit conservative estimates, but what you note here is that in with pickup markets, when there is no hassle involved in making returns, or the hassle involved is pretty minimal, the share of padded orders that are bubble purchases is roughly 13 to 19% across these HL and HH policies. So these are fairly significant numbers, right? Roughly 1 in 5 orders are sort of composed of these bubble orders, which really don't benefit anyone. On the other hand, for without pickup market, where there was some hassle involved in sort of the return experience, again, the statistical estimates are sort of, the p-values are pretty high and so on. We see that there is no increase in return rate. The bubble purchases don't really exist. And so if we sort of put all these sort of demand model, which tells you for a given threshold, for a given shipping fee, what is the customer going to order? And then the return model that we have over here, what I can do is basically I can compute a retailer profit for each and every combination of a shipping fee and threshold. So even though in my data only observe 3 different combinations, LL, HL, and HH, here I can sort of do all these counterfactual calculations. Like if I had set a certain shipping fee and a certain threshold, what would the order be, what would the returns be, and so on, and eventually what would the profit be for the retailer. And so what we see here is that the optimal CFS policy differs quite a bit, quite significantly for with pickup and without pickup markets. So as the hassle cost of making a return changes, my CFS policy can change dramatically. And this distinction is important because if, let's say I take a policy from over here, from without pickup markets, and apply it blindly to with pickup markets, I mean, just based on these estimates, I would see a significant decrease in profit or a pretty substantial increase in bubble purchases. Okay, so these distinctions are important, not just like statistically, but also sort of economically. So I think that's pretty much, I mean, there's a few more details which, or a few more analysis we do just to make sure all of these estimates are causal, are robust, are not just some spurious correlations. But the key sort of takeaway, in some senses, was a fairly, I think, simple talk. It's easy to understand. What we wanted to understand, and the key thing we bring to, in this talk is tie together the sort of front side of the customer experience, which is how you order, to the reverse side. Once you ordered, what happens to the return process? Is that moving as well because of the policies that the retailer is setting? And what we sort of eventually, when I had posed this question, how should a retailer set a CFS policy given a low hassle or a high hassle, it wasn't very obvious what the answer should be. But hopefully at this point, the building blocks are pretty clear, and therefore the answer is a little bit more clear as well. And so what we saw is that a few things play a role. People pad their orders, but of course people are also likely to abandon the orders. But one significant thing that also happens is there are more or less bubble purchases depending on the hassles involved in making a return. And so what is really going on is the bubble purchases are pretty significant when returns are easy, and they more or less disappear when returns are not easy. And so as a result, our prescription based on this paper is that if the return process is convenient, if that is the market you're operating in, if that is how your policies are, then you should set lenient CFS policies, like set low threshold, set low fee, because if you become too aggressive with that, you will sort of start incurring more and more bubble purchases, which can actually backfire. On the other hand, if you're operating in a market where there are significant sort of hassles involved in making a return, it could be monetary, it could be non-monetary, it could be something as simple as when does your money come back into your account. If you're in that kind of a world, then sort of your CFS policies can be a little bit more stringent, a high threshold and a high fee. Okay. And so that is the central message of the paper. A retailer needs to sort of carefully think about how to set the CFS policies. These are the few of the building blocks in that process. And of course, there's a lot more to think about it. There's a couple more things in the paper as well, which I haven't mentioned here. But this topic remains sort of dear to me. So if you have any questions and comments, I would love to take some questions. Thank you so much. Yes. Right. Right. Sure. Yeah. So actually, that's a great point. And I think that point would work regardless of whatever your CFS policy is. Because what you're talking about essentially is if a customer without ordering can assess a fit of a particular product, then no one has to go through that painful process of getting a product, trying it on, scheduling a return, and so on. We can just eliminate a lot of that. What I wanted to focus on here is sort of a non-fit related reason. This is purely almost like a gaming the system kind of a reason, right? That there was no other reason that CFS policies should have affected the return rates apart from these bubble purchase phenomena. So that's a great point, something I believe you should work on, or others should work on. Yeah.
Point further, I was just wondering, I mean, would it differ, at least in terms of the quantitative effect size,
Sure.
on what the item is? Like if
Right.
it is, say, something else where
Right.
the probability of return to begin with is lesser. I mean, I don't know. I am unable to think if
Sure,
it
sure.
actually becomes confounding. It might not, but I think the effect sizes will, like if you do a triple DID in the last step, perhaps you will get a different effect.
Right.
So then
right.
managerial insights can be accordingly given to what
Fair
the
enough. Fair enough. So basically, the increase in return rate might not be the same for all kinds of products. Some sort of products are more likely to be added as like a bubble purchase and therefore will incur a lot more increase in return rate. That's a very fair point. In fact, something we haven't looked into it, but that's I think it's very worthwhile.
So I have a question.
Yes.
Do we see a difference in these in the behavior with regards to padded purchasing and bubble purchases for different kind of markets? For example, wherein the surroundings are like affluent
Right.
surroundings
Yeah.
vis-a-vis, say a neighborhood which is comparatively,
Right.
have a lower level of income, and so people like pad more. Is there sort of any inference that can
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
see that behavior?
I mean, it's a great point. We haven't looked into it, but I'm sure there might be some difference because a lot of this is how willing you are to game the system, and not every single customer is similarly willing. So income can play a role. Some other cultural norms can play a role. We haven't really broken down this effect. We've sort of stuck to this sort of aggregate effect. That's a great point. Uh-huh. Sure. For Right, that's true. One thing we sort of wanted to do initially, but it didn't seem like a good strategy later on, is sort of exploit more sort of the change in a single customer's behavior across the policies. But we saw that customers are not that recurrent. Like oftentimes you would see only 2 or 3 purchases from a single customer. So it wasn't sort of that, yeah, just statistically appealing. But if Right, exactly. If we, see a lot of repeat purchases from the same kind of customer, then that's a great identification, right? Because the same customer, and now you suddenly start behaving differently. So something is going on. Yeah, that's a great point.
Rob, there's an online question.
Sure.
For e-retailers which sell high value premium products,
Right.
how the CFS policy should be planned,
Yeah.
and is it even relevant?
No, it's a great point, actually. So I think this is mostly relevant for low margin retailers. Because one thing I forgot to point out earlier is one draw for the retailer in setting the CFS policy is getting some sort of a shipping revenue from customers, right? Because you incur, like your margins are pretty thin, 4-5%, and you're sending these customers goods for free, and that's a huge cost. So why not get some money from customers? But if you're a high margin retailer selling like, expensive Garmin watches or something, that shipping fee revenue is not that significant. So it's probably not relevant. And it's a good point to sort of highlight. Yeah. So in our case, it was a fashion retailer which operated with pretty thin margins. And I think that's probably more typical case. Awesome. I think that's my time. So thank you so much for having me. I'll let you. Yeah, no, my pleasure.